Welcome back everyone to another video on the Vixen Victory channel. Today we're going to be talking about Ayato, and yes, I am a little bit sick, but before we go ahead and talk about him, we've obviously been making our way through the different character archive characters, talking about the new characters as they release, as well as the on-banner 5 stars as well. But now that we're in our Inazuming characters, let's go ahead and talk about Ayato. With him, he's an AoE type Hydro damage character. Now you might say he's based on normal attacks, but those have a lot of AoE when using them, as well as he has some extra things in his skill and burst that allow for multiple hits on enemies as well. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into his kit, talking about his different talent level priority. Now, even though I talked about him using normal attacks, technically you don't have to level into the normal attack talent. Very similar to how some other characters are, where, for instance, Raiden, a character we previously talked about, when she uses her normal attacks after using her burst, that's actually counted as elemental burst damage. Now, looking at Ayato, when you use your skill, those damage hits that you're doing in your skill that are enhanced and hydro infused are actually going to be based in the skill attributes in the skill. So those damage hits are based on what you can get here in the skill attributes, not what you get in your normal attack talent. So in technicality, the only two things that you have to level with Ayato are his skill and his burst. Now, if you obviously want to, you can technically level into the normal attack talent a little bit, but I wouldn't really recommend going into it too much, if at all. Looking at his skill though, let's go ahead and talk about how it really works. In a basic sense, Ayato is going to shift away from the initial state where you are, allowing basically a watery illusion to take his place. Now, with this little watery illusion, if an opponent gets too close to it, it will explode, or if the duration of this state that he's going to put himself in when using his skill, if that state does end, then the watery illusion will also explode as well. So whether or not, if the opponents are nearby, or if the 6-second duration ends from the skill state, then that watery illusion will explode. In the state that he's creating with his skill, Ayato uses basically different attacks, which you can see here. These first 3 hits are going to be Hydro-infused AoE damage. Now, the idea with this, though, is that you can't override this, which is very nice. And also with that, keep in mind you can't use charge or plunging attacks. But the nice thing is that you have an increased resistance to interruption as well. The also great thing about this is that they are very fast attacks, so they are very fast hitting, allowing for constant damage as well as very fast, blindingly fast damage as well. So if you do have other characters that can help with increasing attack speed, that can technically make this even better. After one of these attacks hits an opponent, it will grant Ayato the Namisen effect. Once you have this effect, it increases the damage dealt by those attacks based on Ayato's current max HP. So putting Double Hydro on the team increases his max HP, which is good and what you would want more of. The initial amount of stacks you can get from Namisen is 4, so if we look over here, per stack you can get 4 of these, and you do have that damage bonus. At level 1, it is 0.56% of your max HP times the amount of stacks that you have. So if you had 4 of these at level 1, you would get a 2%-ish, increase based on whatever max HP Ayato has. Looking at the end of the skill, if Ayato leaves the field, the Conca state will end. Also, if you use this state while the state's already going, if you use the skill while it's already happening, it will just reset the cooldown and the duration as well for you to make sure that that other state is gone, so you can only have one on field. Looking at the burst now, let's go ahead and talk about it. States that it's basically a huge area of just constant AoE hydro damage that's just hitting, and also while you're doing this and using this, this increases the normal attack damage of characters within it. Obviously, since Ayato is mainly focusing into normal attacks, that extra damage bonus is nice. As you can see, at level 1, you have a normal attack damage bonus of 11%, and that will scale as it gets higher. The duration is 18 seconds, and the cooldown is only 20 seconds, so you only have a 2-second downtime, really, between this, which is very easy to get based on the other characters. Usually, you'll start out with your burst, so that you can then go into your skill and do a bunch of those normal attack hits that are still based on your skill, though, and increasing that damage that you're doing with this as well. Keep in mind, when you're looking at other characters, and we'll talk about this later, he still is doing normal attack damage. The damage numbers may be based off the skill, so leveling into the skill is a smart idea, but if you are getting any outside effects that are helping with normal attack damage, that will still help these 3 damage hits that he'll be consistently doing over time. Those damage hits are still technically normal attack damage, just their modifiers are based on the skill. So any characters that can help with normal attack damage increases will still help these damage hits that he's doing to be better and increase them. Looking at the first passive talent he has, this skill has the following priorities. After you use the skill, Ayato will gain 2 Namisen stacks, which obviously means that you can get to the maximum 4 a lot quicker. When the water illusion explodes, so if you happen to throw it on an enemy or if the duration ends, Ayato will also gain a Namisen effect equal to the maximum number of stacks possible, which means a maximum of 4. Usually the best situation to do here is pop the burst, go ahead and ride onto an enemy and pop your skill, getting that huge water illusion to do a big damage hit, and then also giving yourself maximum Namisen stack effect hits. At that point in time, you'll get those maximum stacks to then do maximum damage for him, and that'll make sure that his entire time, he'll have the maximum number that he can do for damage. Looking at his second passive talent, if Ayato is not on the field and his energy is less than 40, he will regenerate 2 energy for himself every second. The nice thing about that is he has a very high energy cost, and we already talked about how the usefulness of his burst is actually very good for him. So obviously getting to have, if you're less than 40, getting extra energy for every single second while your other characters are going through and he's not on the field, getting the extra energy is going to be very nice for him. Also because you're not really going too heavily into energy recharge. You want to have a good amount, but you're not full-blown going into energy recharge with him. You want to focus on the other stats that are actually going to make him do damage. Looking beyond his talents now, let's go ahead and talk about weapons. Now we're going to back out of here and actually go to a character that actually has sword weapons so we can see what the actual other weapons are going to be. Now with his different weapons, obviously his personal weapon is going to be his best weapon. But like normal, we don't really talk about the best weapon. Obviously, Harangapaku Futsu, we don't really talk about the weapons for the character if they obviously are for that specific character. So we're going to be skipping this specific weapon, but keep in mind it is one of his best weapons. He ascends into crit damage, so a weapon like this that goes into crit rate is very nice. Keeping that in mind, going to some other weapons that are going to be good. One of the backups for him is Primordial Jade Cutter. This has a maximum increased crit rate of 44.1% at level 90. Also, it increases HP by 20%. Now, we already talked about how if we look at Ayato, basically, he's doing more damage based on his max HP, but the actual straight up damage numbers he has were still based off of attack. So people might be asking, okay, so what does that really mean? Technically, in a very basic sense, he goes into HP and attack. So once again, if we look at these damage numbers, if there's nothing there, it's based off of attack. The only thing that gives him a max damage increase is based off his max HP for the Namisen stacks that he can get. So HP is useful, but it's not necessarily the thing that you should go so heavily into. So if you happen to get these things on artifacts where if you get some HP percent, don't necessarily think of it as a bad stat. Think of it as an extra way for him to get some extra damage, but it really shouldn't be something that you go so heavily into. But at the end of the day, when you're actually looking at things, going into a weapon like Primordial Jade Cutter, giving your character basically more HP is very nice to see and have. Also, it'll provide an attack bonus based on the 1.2% of the wielder's max HP. This is at R1 of Primordial Jade Cutter. Once again, another reason to give attack bonus, which is those actual damage stats that he has. So going higher into HP, which he already kind of does, getting the extra attack increase, a very good weapon and second to his personal weapon at every sense of the word for me personally. Now another backup weapon for this is going to be Mistsplitter Reforged, which is his sister's weapon, Ayaka. Looking at Mistsplitter, it does ascend into crit damage, which means you're going to have to focus and make sure you get some crit rate somewhere. But it is a nice little bump because when you're gaining an extra elemental damage bonus from the actual major part of the kit, and then as soon as you get into it, you receive the Might of Mistsplitter's emblem, and then you get certain stacks based on what you can actually do. So if you do a normal attack that deals elemental damage, if you cast a burst, and if you have energy less than 100%, you're going to get stacks of the Mistsplitter's emblem, increasing more of your elemental damage bonus. So a very good weapon that can kind of be a backup, obviously. This weapon right here is pretty good. It does help with some extra bits and pieces throughout the entire kit of the weapon. I've even seen people talk about Light of Foliar Incision for him because dealing elemental damage increases more, and based off the elemental mastery helps a little bit more with your normal attacks and elemental skill hits. Technically, this weapon could be good as well, just because it increases crit rate as well as crit damage in the main stat, and then also, like I was talking about, increasing normal attacks based on elemental mastery. Usually with Ayato, you're doing some sort of vape team, so getting elemental mastery on him is nice, but once again, it's about the same as HP percent. It's not the major thing that you're going after, but if you happen to get a stack of it or somewhere, if you get a few of them, it's not necessarily a wasted piece. Now, another weapon that you could use that's not necessarily one of his best 5-star weapons, but if you do have a 5-star weapon like this, Skyward Blade is a nice weapon as well. It's one of the ones closer to the bottom of the 5 stars, but it does increase energy recharge by 55.1% at level 90 with 608 base attack. Also, it increases crit rate by 4%. And then you'll increase your attack speed by 10%, you'll increase your movement speed by 10%, and normal and charge attacks deal additional damage equal to 20% of your attack. So after you're using that burst, that's going to help a lot of those things, increasing attack speed, increasing movement speed, increasing normal attack hits, which Ayato is going to be doing. So it is still a pretty good weapon, just the main stat, because it is ER, doesn't hold that much value over the other weapons. Looking at 4 stars now, though, a weapon that is more Battle Pass specific is the Black Sword. This weapon is very good because it increases damage dealt by normal and charge attacks by 20%. Also, the main stat at 27.6% at level 90 is good. Once again, he ascends into crit damage. Getting a crit rate weapon is nice to make sure you have a nice balance ratio, but it's a pretty good ability for a 4-star weapon. But keep in mind, this isn't free to play. This is very based on the Battle Pass. So if you do have it and you do have the weapon to go for, I would go ahead and pick this up for him, but once again, not extremely have to get it necessarily for him. There are some other weapons like Finale of the Deep, which is another weapon that you could definitely use as well for him. This weapon, when you use an elemental skill, the attack gets an increase, as well as it talks about some Bond of Life instances, which you don't care about too much, but it's basically a huge stack bonus for attack in the main stat, as well as the ability, so it's a nice huge jump to a lot of attack. Another weapon that works well for just the main stat and a little bit of help for the ability is a huge stat stick for the attack percent in Ishin, this specific weapon. Also, it gives an attack increase as well, and even a little bit of extra damage hit somewhere else as well. But honestly, I think that getting an attack increase in the ability as well as the main stat going into attack percent allows for a lot of help for Ayato, allowing you to focus very heavily into crit on his stats in the artifacts. Now that we've talked about weapons, let's go ahead and talk about artifacts. With Ayato, the different artifacts that you really want to focus into are kind of very different. The great thing about Ayato is that he's pretty easy to build because he sits on one of the best 4-piece sets that are very easy for a lot of people to get, which is Gladiator's Finale. Now, I've ransacked my Gladiator's Finale and leveled a lot of pieces and gotten rid of a lot as well, but most people should have a pretty good amount of this, and you've kept probably a pretty good pieces over time, especially if you've been playing the game for a while. Bosses drop them and whatnot, so it's very easy to get pretty good pieces for these. The 2-piece increases attack, which we know he mainly goes off for his damage, and if the wielder of this artifact set uses a sword, which he does, it'll increase the normal attack damage by 35%. So a very good artifact set here to go after, and if you probably already have the pieces for this, this is arguably one of his best sets and does contend with technically his personal set as well. Now, when we talk about his personal set, we're going to be talking about Echoes of an Offering. This set increases the 2-piece with attack, the same as the other set, but in the 4-piece it states that when normal attacks hit opponents, there's a 36% chance that Valley Right will trigger, and at this point in time, Valley Right will increase normal attack damage by 70% of your attack, and this effect will be dispelled 0.05 seconds after a normal attack deals damage. Every single time that your normal attack fails to trigger Valley Right, it'll have a 20% increased chance. So every time you do a normal attack, which we remember, all of those normal attacks are hitting very fast with Ayato, as well as if you're using certain weapons and certain buffs, you'll get even more attack speed increases. You'll have a 36% chance on the first one, 56% chance on the second, 76% chance on the third. It's stacking to the point that it's pretty easy, and with how fast he's doing them, you're probably going to be hitting a pretty big damage hit pretty consistently with this 4-piece set, and it is nice to see that you get this. But that does, kind of go into a very gotcha system with the 4-piece, which is why a lot of people usually just stick with the 4-piece of Gladiator's Finale. Another 4-piece set that you could use is Heart of Depth. The 2-piece increases Hydro damage bonus, and the 4-piece states that after using an elemental skill, which he already does, normal and charge attack damage is increased by 30% for 15 seconds. Another way for him to do a lot of normal attack damage after using a skill, which he already does, and it is for an entire 15 seconds, which you're not really going to be using most of the time because, once again, that initial damage phase that he has for duration in that state is 6 seconds long. Another 4-piece set beyond Heart of Depth that you could use is talking about one of the newer sets, which is Nymph's Dream. Now, newer is probably a misleading word considering we've had so many new sets, and this came out during the End of the Desert, but still this is quote unquote, I guess in my mind, still a newer set. But basically the 2-piece states that the Hydro damage bonus is increased by 15%, And then after a normal charge and plunging attacks, elemental skills, or elemental bursts hit opponents, you're going to get a stack of Mirrored Nymph, which will last for 8 seconds. And when under the effect of 1, 2, or 3 or more of these stacks, attack will be increased by 7, 16, and 25% attack, and the Hydro damage bonus will be increased by 4, 9, and 15%. Any of these stacks will exist independently, so as you're grabbing them over time, you'll make sure to actually get these. Now, remember, when you're using the skill will hit, the burst will hit, you're already at 2 stacks, and as soon as you do a normal attack, you'll immediately be at 3 stacks. So it's very easy for him to immediately be at 3 stacks, and because he hits so often, it's very easy for him to sit at 3 stacks. So staying at 25% attack as well as 15% Hydro damage bonus, doubling the 2-piece that you already have, going for a 30% Hydro damage bonus altogether with the 2-piece and 4-piece together, allows you to keep those stacks and those damage increases for the entirety of the duration that he's in his skill. So a nice little 4-piece there as well. I think overall it just depends on which set. I know technically between his best set, Echoes of an Offering and Gladiator's Finale are the 2 sets that are kind of tending to go between which one's better. You'll see most people, though, use Gladiator's Finale just because of how many pieces they usually have or how good their pieces are. So if you're debating between actually grinding out Echoes of an Offering or not, I would say if you have pretty good pieces on Gladiator's Finale, don't worry about it. But if you do have some pretty, if you have some okay pieces, but they're not really working for Glad or they're on other characters, I would say to just bite the bullet and go ahead and grind out Echoes of an Offering, or you could just wait over time for Gladiator's Finale, or if you happen to have some of these other 4-piece sets that could work as well, you could use them. Looking at main stats, with the Sand, you're going to want to go attack percent. With the Goblet, you're going to want to go Hydro damage bonus. And with the Circlet, you're going to want to go either crit or crit damage. Now, once again, because usually with him, he's ascending into crit damage. And if you have a crit damage weapon, you're going to want to focus into a crit rate Circlet. Once again, just keep a very balanced ratio with obviously his crit ratio. He's a damage character, so you want to keep that in mind. In terms of substats, you should be going for attack percent and double crit. Beyond that, you really could be looking for HP percent and EM. And even if you really want to, ER. But I think that beyond the top 3 stats of attack percent and crit rate and crit damage, getting HP percent or getting EM isn't really a problem, and technically neither is ER, but you don't want to stack so heavily into those on pieces that don't necessarily actually need it, because he doesn't want, for instance, this piece on Bennett. Bennett actually likes a very high ER, but you don't want to have so much ER that things like attack percent or anything else like that are taking the blow because of it, or especially attack percent and the double crits. So if you have something that's high into those, you probably want to look for a different piece. Now looking a little bit further into his kit, let's go ahead and talk about Constellations. His first constellation states that those damage hits he's doing in his skill, that damage is increased by 40% against opponents with less than 50% HP. So helping a little bit more. Obviously, as they get lower HP, you can do more damage, which will then make sure that they are going to be finished quicker, which is allowing, probably this constellation is really focusing, as you can see more and more. Ayato is very based on he's not really boss oriented, he's very AoE waves of enemies oriented because of the AoE Hydro damage that you can hit, as well as obviously this C1. Yes, it does work against bosses, but when you have smaller enemies that are lower than 50%, it's going to do more damage to them, which is going to make them die extremely faster than a boss really would, obviously because they have a higher health pool. The bosses have a higher health pool than the smaller enemies, but this is exactly why I think this C1 is a little bit more instigated for kind of waves of enemies, forcing him into that role a little bit more where he already sits in. The C2 states that Namisen's maximum stack count increases to 5, which obviously increasing more means more damage for him. And then when Ayato has at least 3 of these stacks, his max HP is increased by 50% of the max HP. So if he has 30,000 HP and you have 3 of these stacks, which we saw in the burst and all that, or that stuff basically in his passive talents, you can get a maximum of those stacks if you have that water illusion explode, which gives you maximum of stacks possible. Notice how it doesn't say 4 or 5. So if you have the C2, it immediately brings you to 5, which is very nice to see with this constellation kind of coming into play with the rest of his kit. Also, the more HP he has, the more max HP he has, the more damage that he can do, because those Namisen stacks are based on max HP. So very good to see that there. Even though it's a little bit more basic and it's almost little bits of increases, this huge max HP increase actually makes this damage number even bigger and a very good constellation. Now looking at the C3, it increased the level of the skill by 3, and the C5 increased the level of the burst by 3. The C4 states that after using the burst, all nearby party members have 15% increased normal attack speed for 15 seconds. That includes Ayato himself, which means that he can do more hits, obviously, in a faster period of time, triggering other effects based on artifact sets or his actual kit or even weapons or whatever. So making sure that he can do that is allowing him to hit blindingly even faster than he already does, allowing for faster stacks of the things that he needs either in his kit or in those artifact sets we were talking about earlier. Now looking at the C6, it states that after using the skill, Ayato's next attack in the skill will create 2 extra of those strikes when they hit opponents, each one dealing 450% of Ayato's attack as damage. Both of these attacks will not be affected by the Namisen stack effect. So basically, you're hitting, if you hit once, you're actually hitting 3 times. But the major damage hit that you're actually hitting with Ayato is the thing that can have the Namisen kind of stacks that he can get, but the extra 2 attacks are not based on those Namisen stack effects. So very good constellations overall. From what I've seen, most people still keep their Ayato at C0. If you're looking for some constellations to go after, if you really like Ayato, I do think the C1 is good. Don't get me wrong, it's a great one, but I think the kind of star of the show here is the C2. So if you are looking for any constellations from him in the future, and you kind of don't care about any future characters or whatnot, I would say looking at that C2 is pretty good for him, and grabbing the C1 while you're at it isn't necessarily, terrible either as well. Looking over at teams really for Ayato, obviously he's going to be heavily based in usually teams that are focusing on vaporize. The issue with him, because he hits so often, it's kind of like putting Neuvillette in a vaporize team. It's very difficult for him to be constantly vaporizing. The whole point here is actually to not really make Ayato vaporize, which usually doesn't make any sense because he's the damage dealer. So characters like Mavuika in the future who could possibly help out with vaporize from off field, characters like Xiangling or whatever that can also help with vaporize, and Dia are going to be very nice for this type of character, but you're actually helping that pyro character vaporize rather than helping Ayato vaporize because of how blindingly fast he can already do this without any normal attack speed increases anyways. So with the types of teams you're really going to be running, usually it's going to be Ayato with a pyro off-fielder like Xiangling, Kazuha, and Bennett. The attack increases and healing from Bennett's there. Xiangling's creating the double pyro for the resonance to increase attack even more. Xiangling's obviously making sure that she can hit pyro from off-field, and she herself is probably vaporizing, and Kazuha is there for viridescent as well as elemental damage bonus. Now there are different types of characters you can kind of move around there, but that is the major idea with those characters. There are other teams that Ayato can work in, and kind of a little bit different, especially since the kind of approach of Dendro characters have released. Bloom teams have come into effect, and even characters like Hyper Bloom teams, because he has to be usually pretty close to attack enemies, characters like Kuki or whatever can be thrown into his team with 2 Dendro characters to make sure that, obviously characters like Nahida and Yao Yao or Baiju or whatever as a healer, or even just other characters like Dendro main character or Kale or whatever, they can allow for constant blooming with Ayato's constant Hydro hits. The constant Dendro you can get from these other Dendro characters is allowing constant blooms, and Kuki can come in afterwards and reap havoc with just constant Hyper Bloom hits, allowing for a lot of damage. Now, you don't really see a lot of personal damage coming from Ayato at this point in time, which you'll usually see with a lot of Hyper Bloom teams anyways, but technically Ayato can make this team work pretty well. On that front, actually, if you take that exact same team between the 2 Dendro characters or more with Ayato and just switch out Kuki with Toma, the King of Burgeon, easily makes a pretty good Burgeon team as well. Ayato is very good for constantly applying that type of stuff, so even if you want to use a character like Nilou off-field, which you probably will run her on-field, but technically even, which I'm not really going to say this is one of probably his best teams, even still, because once again, this isn't really helping his personal damage, but technically he can be an on-fielder for constant blooms for a Nilou and Ayato, Nahida, and some other Dendro character team, allowing for constant bloom damage hits, which obviously Nilou is creating her special ones when she creates them, so it's very easy to get a lot of blooms, once again, off the consistent amount of Hydro application you can get from Ayato, and the consistent amount of Dendro application you can get from characters like Nahida, Dendro main character, Kale, blah, 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 blah. But with that team, you'll probably want to make sure that you're running a healer, so characters like Yao Yao and Baiju are probably going to be that 4th member, rather than someone like Kale or someone like Dendro main character. Besides that, once again, I think one of his best teams is really focusing into the Vaporize team, but technically you could run some freeze teams with him. I wouldn't really recommend it because I'm not really too fond of the freeze teams with him, but characters like Layla, Shenhe, constant Hydro appliers like even Charlotte as well, another healer in the team as well, could even run there and do some pretty good work. I know characters like Chi-Chi and other characters that are pretty good at constant cryo application could actually be pretty helpful for his team, even adding some shields and stuff like that for a freeze team. But I think overall, leaving his sister to the freeze teams is probably a better idea. So if you are trying to run Ayato with a freeze team, maybe you could make it work, and obviously definitely can, but it's not going to be, in my personal opinion, one of his best teams, kind of like the Nilou Bloom team, not really one of his personal best teams. It's just kind of something that's going to help either for mobs of enemies, just keeping them frozen so that he can constantly attack them, or basically just making more AoE damage in those Bloom teams or anything like that. Well, that's everything I've got talking about Ayato. If you guys have any other ideas about teams that Ayato can really go into, please go ahead and let me know down in the comments. Or if you guys have any other ideas about how you guys play Ayato, maybe if you're looking forward to some other characters like future Pyro appliers or whatever, go ahead and let me know. I'd love to see a little bit more of the Ayato fan base, because usually I don't see too many of them anyways anymore. Usually some other characters have taken the spotlight. Well, if you guys did like the video, please go ahead and like and subscribe. And thank you guys for watching the video. I'll see you guys in the next one.